Hello, and welcome to today's success workshop titled Bye Bye Test Anxiety. As we reach midterm, you likely have a good idea of where you stand in each of your classes. And as you know, test performance can make up a really big chunk of your grade. Test anxiety is a very common feeling amongst all students. And so today we're going to talk about the ways to alleviate or at least lessen that test anxiety. We are going to split today's workshop into 4 sections. First, we will start with an introduction to test anxiety. We'll answer the question, what is it and how do students experience test anxiety? Next, we'll talk about methods that you can use before the test to help get rid of that test anxiety. Then we'll venture into methods that you can use during the test to relieve that test anxiety. And finally, we'll talk about steps that you can take after the test to calm your nerves and plan ahead for your next test. First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sam, and I'm an academic coach in the Learning Commons at TCC, and my job is to help students in any way that I can in order for them to be successful in class. And while I can help students in just about any academic area, I do specialize in study and test taking strategies, in time management and organization, note-taking, motivation, and goals. I know that college is not a one-size-fits-all experience, so working with students to find the right combination of skills, whether that's in studying or in alleviating their test anxiety, and ultimately seeing that aha moment is one of the best parts of my job. And I've included my email address on this slide just in case you don't have it. So let's go ahead and get started with the very first section of our workshop today. We're just going to talk very briefly about test anxiety. What is it and how do students experience it? First, I do want to define test anxiety. So we're all working with the same definition here. So for the purpose of our presentation, we're going to look at test anxiety as a psychological state in which a person experiences emotional distress and or physical symptoms while in a testing situation. And typically students report that test anxiety hurts their test performance or their grades. So those emotional symptoms and those physical symptoms then impact how well they do on a test. But how one person experiences test anxiety can be very different from how another student experiences test anxiety. I mentioned that test anxiety has both emotional symptoms and physical symptoms, so let's take a look at each of those really quickly. So emotional symptoms can include self-doubt, so not really knowing how you're going to do on a test or feeling like you're not going to do well automatically. It could include fear, stress, feelings of hopelessness, so feeling like no matter what you do, you're still not going to do well on that test, inadequacy, anger, feeling nervous, or even feeling restless or fidgety. But there are also those physical symptoms like sweating, feeling nauseous, having stomach pain, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, headaches, feeling lightheaded or faint while taking a test, or insomnia, so not being able to sleep prior to an exam. Yesterday, I asked students on my TCC whether they experienced test anxiety, and I had 75 students answer. And an overwhelming majority of students said that they do experience test anxiety on some level. 55% saying that they, yes, experience test anxiety all the time. And 42% said sometimes it really depends on the class. But it goes to show that there is just a very small percentage that report that they have never or they never experienced test anxiety. So this is a very common feeling amongst students. With all things in life, though, test anxiety does exist on something called a continuum. And a continuum is a progression of varying degrees on a scale to, in this case, good to bad. And most students fall somewhere within this continuum without ever reaching either extreme. If a student experiences no test anxiety or very low levels of test anxiety, they may find that they're a little nervous going into a test, but it doesn't really impact their grade. But as we move down the continuum, we see mild test anxiety. And with mild test anxiety, it typically presents in a student that is confident when they are in class and feels really good about the material. They complete the homework assignments with no problem, they get things done. But during tests, a student with mild test anxiety might freeze up, become really indecisive, and might struggle to choose between two answers, and then ends up not doing as well as they thought they would, even though they know and feel really confident in the material. Then as we move into moderate test anxiety, this typically presents in students that have mixed feelings about the class. They might not feel too great about it. These students typically do have some difficulty in class while completing homework, while completing different assignments, and especially during tests. And this is usually due to some sort of limited understanding of the material. And students with moderate test anxiety often forget everything that they've just learned in class very quickly, and then get really frustrated when they don't do well. Then we end up on the other end of the continuum, which is severe test anxiety. And this includes everything that I've just covered. However, students with severe test anxiety might also avoid class or avoid studying altogether in an attempt to avoid feelings of anxiety. And these students may also experience more extreme physical and emotional symptoms and may even experience panic attacks when they are taking tests. But what's important to know is that test anxiety, regardless of which level you experience, can be managed in some way. And I do want to take some time right now, though, to mention that if your test anxiety expands outside of the testing environment, you may benefit from speaking with a counselor. And I know that TCC's Counseling Center offers free individual and group therapy, and students can utilize the Counseling Center to gain support for concerns such as anxiety. So don't be afraid to reach out for that support if you need it. They even host a weekly anxiety and stress management group, and I'll make sure to include information about that group in the chat when we're done with this workshop. When we specifically target test anxiety, though, I do want to stress that management of test anxiety starts before the test, so that you could cope during the test, and then after the test so that it can help you next time around. And so we're going to go through these three here, before, during, and after, and look at these different techniques and see what works best for you. You may want to try them out next time around. So let's dive into what you can do before the test, all of those methods you can use to get rid of test anxiety before you actually sit down to take an exam. So think of this as being while you're preparing for the test. First, we are going to look at positive self-talk. So oftentimes the way in which we talk about ourselves and talk about our intelligence and everything we know can sometimes be a bit negative. So I oftentimes hear students say things like, the material is too hard, I can't do this. And that's a pretty negative thing to say about yourself. Instead, try and switch it into a positive. So instead of saying this is too hard, you might say this is challenging. Now, a challenging, of course, is, difficult, but challenges can be positive. They're something that we can overcome. And something else that I hear a lot of the time is students saying things like, I'm bad at, for example, math. Or I'm bad at a particular subject. I'm not a math person, I'm more of an English person, or I'm not good at science. Instead, I want you to think about where you were at the very beginning of the semester, where you were starting out, and really look at all the ways in which you are improving. So instead of saying, I'm bad at math, you might say, I'm improving. Next, we're going to talk about visualization and meditation. So visualization is a technique for relieving stress in just about any situation. And you can think of visualization in a way like daydreaming, but with a purpose. And visualization requires you to close your eyes and build an environment using your imagination that causes extreme relaxation. So you may want to close your eyes now and imagine that you are in the most relaxing place you could be. You want to think about, what does that look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? Who are you with? How do you feel when you're super relaxed in this environment? So you do want to try to imagine the environment around you. And when I practice visualization, I typically imagine that I'm in a cabin in the mountains, the windows open, it's mid-fall, there's a nice breeze, the air is cold, I can see the orange and red leaves around me. It's really quiet and peaceful, and ultimately that helps you to relax. Perhaps you're thinking of a beach with waves crashing against the shore. Something like this, imagining and visualizing yourself in a really relaxing location can help relieve some of that stress. And something that can really help you imagine this location and with visualization is there are free apps out there. I have on my phone an app in which it plays ambient sounds. So it will play those waves crashing, it'll play that thunderstorm, whatever the case may be. Or you can find videos on YouTube as well, which mimic these ambient sounds. When it comes to meditation, though, I'm going to allow Sal from Khan Academy to explain a bit more. But if you're interested in meditation, especially as it relates to test anxiety, I recommend that you get on YouTube and look for Khan Academy's Test Anxiety Meditation series. But I'm going to go ahead and play that now.
Hello, Sal here from Khan Academy. So when you hear the word meditation, for many of y'all, it might evoke some type of new age thing that has nothing to do with standardized tests. And if you're about to take a standardized test, I'm sure there's many thoughts about, am I prepared? Am I going to do well? I hope I don't bomb the exam. That stress and that anxiety is, if anything, going to hurt your performance on these things that you want to do well. And so meditation is a way to help still that. But it's really just for you to observe your thoughts, not get stressed out about it if your thoughts start to wander, but then just bring them back and try to not think, or think about just very positive thoughts. And I think if you do that, you're going to find you're going to be happier, you're going to be more positive, all sorts of positive energy is going to be attracted to you. And even though that's not the most important thing in the world, you'll do just fine on these tests that right now you might be worrying about.
All right, the next method for alleviating test anxiety before the test is listed here. It's speak the fear, then think rationally. Sometimes test anxiety stems from irrational thinking or fears that we keep bottled up inside. And in cases like these, speaking out loud the fear that you have, whether that's to a friend, a family member, advisor, a coach, or even just saying it out loud to yourself could be a helpful outlet. Alternatively, you could also write it down. But once you've had a chance to really think about what is that fear that you have, what is causing that test anxiety, try to think more rationally about it. Think in terms of, if this happens, then this could happen, sort of statements. And oftentimes this allows our minds to slow down a little bit. And just understand that regardless of the outcome of the test, it really has no weight or bearing on our value as people and as students. So try speaking the fear and then thinking rationally. Another way to help relieve some of the pre-test jitters is to know what to expect as you're going into that test. And so I always recommend creating a list. Maybe it's a list in your head, maybe you write it down, but you do want to think about these things. So which chapters or modules are going to be on the test? Well, once you know that, you'll know exactly where to prepare and where to focus your study time. Will it be an open or closed book exam? And considering if it's open book, do I plan to use my book or do I plan to use my notes? And really thinking about these things beforehand. Is it going to be an honor lock exam? That comes with its own difficulties, but knowing beforehand, definitely going to prepare you. Ask yourself, especially with honor lock, am I allowed to use scratch paper? If so, then that might affect the way in which you take the exam. What kinds of questions can you expect? Is it a multiple choice test? Is it going to be fill in the blank? Are there going to be example type questions where you're given an example and you have to think about how it can be applied in real life? Think about these things and really take into account what your professor is telling you about the test beforehand. How much time are you going to have and how many questions are there? That's going to help you determine how much time you should have per question. But overall, if you know what to expect, you can make sure that you are better prepared and then nothing is really left to be a surprise on test day. Next, I want you to think about replicating the testing environment. So it could be really easy to replicate the test environment if you're given a practice test, and this is often in math classes. But if you're not given a practice test, perhaps there is a study guide that is available to you. Maybe your professor provides PowerPoints or other reference materials. And if so, you may want to consider creating your own practice test. If you're not given these materials, then you may want to try this out while you're studying. But what does it really mean to replicate the testing environment? So first, you want to time yourself for the exact amount of time that you're going to have on the exam. In this case, we're going to pretend like we have a practice test. You want to make sure that if you are going to actually have 60 minutes on the exam, that while you're taking that practice test, you go ahead and set that timer for 60 minutes. So you know how fast you have to go, you know how long you can take on each problem. You really want to pretend like this is the real thing. If it is a closed book, then you don't want to rely on the textbook or your notes while you're completing that practice test. Or if you're going through the study guide, you don't want to rely on your textbook or your notes if it's going to be closed book. What good is that going to be? You don't want to rely too much on the materials you're not actually going to have on test day. And you really want to take it seriously and pace yourself as if it were the real test. Another way to replicate the test environment, especially if you are studying. So say you aren't given a practice test. While studying, if you know you're going to be taking your exam at home, sit in the same room at the same exact time, under the same conditions that you will on test day. This can help, because it's a familiar environment, relieve some of that stress that you might feel as you're preparing for the test. Next, I know that when you are feeling anxious, especially about a test, it's normal to want to look back at your notes for last-minute study sessions, and that's normal. But when it comes down to it, though, you do want to make sure that the night before your test, you are prioritizing sleep. And I know the temptation is going to be there to cram. And when you're feeling test anxiety, one of those symptoms I mentioned was insomnia, and that insomnia might try to kick in. But what I want you to do, go ahead and fight it and prioritize rest. And the reason for this is that sleep is actually vitally important when forming long-term memories. And what we hope for, especially when you're studying and especially when you're preparing for a test, is that everything that you're learning then goes into your long-term memories. And the great thing about long-term memories is that this can then be used on your test. So prioritize rest, prioritize sleep, and try not to cram right before that exam. All right, so we finally made it to test day. We've gone through everything that you can do before the test. Let's go ahead and talk about, now we've made it to test day, now what? So there are 4 methods that I really do want to talk about here when you are taking the test. And I want to stress that these are techniques that you will use while you're taking the test, but it's important to not let these become distractions. Remember, you are taking a test, so you want to stay focused on that. But if you're feeling really overwhelmed and you're feeling really stressed out when you sit down, the first technique you may want to use is called a brain dump. And this is great for all of those tests in which you have scratch paper. And what you'll do is during the first 2 to 3 minutes of the test, before you've even read over the question, you want to go ahead and on your piece of paper, if you're allowed it during the exam, write down everything that you remember. In a math class, this might be formulas. In science, it might be key terms, but the idea is that you're creating sort of a word bank. What are these most important things that I have to remember going into this test? Once you've taken 2 to 3 minutes to do that, go ahead and start the exam. And you always have this scratch paper to refer back to. And this can be really helpful for students who feel like their mind goes blank the second they start reading questions for that exam. Second, and I know this is super simple and of course, deep breathing, but you don't want to forget about deep breathing because it's such a simple and effective technique for calming your nerves. And what we're going to look to do here is something called progressive deep breathing. So first you'll breathe in for 3 seconds and then out for 3 seconds, breathe in for 5 seconds and then out for 5 seconds. And then we'll do it again, breathe in for 10 seconds and out for 10 seconds. And with each breath in, you want to really pay attention to your breath. You want to pay attention to your stomach expanding, focus on your breathing, and it should only take a moment for it to start reducing your racing heart rate, which is, one of those really big symptoms for test anxiety. Next, you also want to make sure that you're pacing yourself. If you've prepared, you likely know, I mentioned how much time you're going to have on the test and how many questions will be on the test. And this should give you an idea of how much time you have per question. So while you're going through the test, make a mental note of the time throughout the exam so that you're staying on track. And if you find that you're stuck on a question, if all of your questions are given at once, scroll away from it and return back to it. But if it's one of those tests where you have one question at a time, it's okay to move on. It's okay to make the decision to move on because you don't want to miss out on all of the questions that you might know the answer to. You don't want to run out of time because you were stuck on this one question. It's okay to move on. If you feel stuck, it's also okay to take a little bit of a break. Take a short break. Perform those deep breathing, progressive deep breathing exercises, and then continue. Make sure you're not spending too much time on that break, but take a moment, reflect, and then go back to the test. Finally, make sure, and I want to stress this, that you are not procrastinating and waiting until the last moment to take your exam. Because something that stress and anxiety can do is it can cause you to procrastinate. So if you know that your test is due, for example, Thursday at 11:59 p.m., then you really don't want to wait until 10:45 the night that the test is due to get started, because this is going to cause a little bit more stress than is needed. It's just unnecessary. All right, so now you've taken the test, now what? And you've probably heard all of the tips before and during the test, but you might overlook everything that you can do after the test to help you going forward. So we're going to talk about what you can do after the test to, one, calm your nerves and better prepare you for next time. So you took the test, now what? The first thing that you want to do immediately after you're finished with the test is go back to that deep breathing. So release the stress, release the tension that you've likely been holding in your shoulders while taking the test, and just focus on your breathing. Next, you want to go ahead and visualize success. So I know I talked about visualization a little bit earlier. Close your eyes, return back to that place of ultimate relaxation, and imagine that you've succeeded. Now, whether this is on succeeding on this one test, or you're imagining just succeeding in whatever your ultimate goal is, doesn't matter. Either way, close your eyes, go back to that relaxing place and imagine it, see it. The next step is to reflect and refocus. And I think this is, when we get to this step 3 and step 4, where many students are missing out. But with number 3, reflect and refocus, this is where you want to reflect on your performance. This might be something that you do right after the test. So reflecting on, okay, I'm sitting down and I'm realizing maybe I could have spent a little more time in this area. Or maybe I could have added a bit more details here. And you want to think about what went right and also what didn't go right, what went wrong, and to really reflect and perhaps even write these things down. And it could be something that you also reflect back on once you get back your test grade. But the idea is that you want to reflect on what you can do better next time. So really taking a moment to think about your own performance and what can you do better going forward. And then lastly, asking for feedback. It's okay to go to your professor, go during office hours or setting up an appointment with them and asking for feedback, saying, hey, I know that I probably didn't do as well as I could have done on the last exam. I'd really like to go through it with you to learn more about, some of the problems that I got wrong. I want to look for my common mistakes and I want tips for improvement. And many times your professor is going to be happy to give you this advice, happy to give you this feedback. But if they perhaps are lacking on the details, maybe they don't go through the entire test with you, you could also think about your common mistakes on your own and write these down and perhaps spend a little bit more time as you're studying for the next test, really focusing on these common mistakes. And it's even something that you can work with a tutor on if you are interested in tutoring with the Learning Commons. All right, so we've talked about things that you can do before the test, during the test, and after the test. And I do want to thank you both for being here this evening for the Bye Bye Test Anxiety Workshop. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But I'm also going to put my email address and my phone number on the PowerPoint slide here. And you're welcome to reach out to me at any point if you'd like to work one-on-one on alleviating your test anxiety.